Ethiopia and Egypt have long been at odds over the Nile River, with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, at the center of the dispute. While Ethiopia argues that GERD is crucial for its economic development and energy security, Egypt insists that it threatens its water supply, as the country depends on the Nile for over 90% of its fresh water. Over the past decade, Ethiopia has faced mounting diplomatic pressure from the Arab League, the United States, and even former President Donald Trump's administration, which at one point threatened to cut aid to Ethiopia in favor of Egypt. Despite these challenges, Ethiopia once stood firm, navigating the international stage with diplomatic resilience. However, the current state of Ethiopian diplomacy suggests a worrisome shift. While Egypt aggressively expands its influence in the region, forming strategic alliances with Ethiopia's neighbors, Addis Ababa appears dormant, failing to counter Cairo's growing diplomatic and military footprint. Egypt is no longer just relying on international pressure to secure its interests. It is actively encircling Ethiopia through strategic agreements with its neighboring states. Cairo is executing a multi-pronged diplomatic and military strategy, creating security and economic alliances with Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, and Eritrea. Egypt and Kenya recently upgraded their bilateral ties to a strategic partnership that places security cooperation at its core. This agreement includes joint military training, counter-terrorism efforts, and intelligence sharing. Egypt is building close relations with Nairobi at a time when Ethiopia-Kenya relations are not at their strongest, particularly after recent trade and economic disputes. Egypt's increasing role in Somalia is particularly alarming for Ethiopia. Cairo has committed to deploying troops in the new AWSOM peacekeeping mission, as well as training and arming the Somali National Army. This level of military cooperation could shift the power dynamics in the Horn of Africa, where Ethiopia has historically maintained influence over Somalia's security affairs. The Egypt-Somalia Defense Pact also raises questions about Ethiopia's own military presence in Somalia, as Addis Ababa previously stationed troops in the country under the AU framework. Djibouti is Ethiopia's most critical trade route, handling over 90% of Ethiopia's import-export trade. If any country gains significant influence in Djibouti, it could potentially control Ethiopia's economic lifeline. Egypt is rapidly increasing its presence in Djibouti through the creation of an Egyptian logistics zone spanning 1 million square meters, military and security cooperation with Djibouti's government, and direct integration of Djibouti's ports with Egyptian maritime transport networks. This should be a red flag for Ethiopia. If Egypt expands its control over Djibouti's infrastructure, it could apply economic pressure on Ethiopia by influencing port access, tariffs, and trade routes. Yet Ethiopia has done little to counter this move, failing to secure a stronger strategic relationship with Djibouti. Last October, Egypt convened a tripartite summit with Eritrea and Somalia in Asmara. This meeting resulted in the creation of a tripartite committee aimed at promoting military and security cooperation. Historically, Eritrea has been a destabilizing force in the region, supporting various Ethiopian opposition groups. The growing Cairo-Asmara ties could further exacerbate tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea, whose relations have already deteriorated after the Tigray War. The Nile Basin Strategy. Egypt is not just focusing on the Horn of Africa, it is expanding its influence across the entire Nile Basin. The Egyptian government recently approved a $100 million financing mechanism for infrastructure and water projects in Nile Basin countries, including Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Egypt is even financing the construction of the Mabanka hydroelectric dam in Congo, strengthening its ties with regional actors while attempting to undermine Ethiopia's leadership in regional energy development. With Donald Trump back in the White House, Washington's position on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, appears to be shifting even further in favor of Egypt. According to recent U.S. diplomatic leaks, the Trump administration is actively considering using GERD as leverage to secure Egypt's support for Trump's controversial Gaza reconstruction plan. The plan reportedly involves relocating Palestinians to areas such as Egypt and Jordan, while rebuilding Gaza under new political arrangements. Given Egypt's crucial role in mediating the Gaza conflict, Trump sees Cairo's backing as essential to advancing his broader Middle East strategy. Recent visits by senior U.S. officials to Egypt have hinted at this geopolitical trade-off. Washington has reportedly indicated that its involvement in GERD negotiations, specifically pressuring Ethiopia to accept a deal favorable to Egypt, is conditional upon Cairo's endorsement of Trump's Gaza proposal. For Ethiopia, this signals a looming diplomatic and economic challenge. If decisive action is not taken, Addis Ababa could once again find itself facing renewed pressure from the U.S., reminiscent of the Trump administration's previous stance when it temporarily withheld aid to Ethiopia over the GERD dispute. A nation watching from the sidelines. While Egypt aggressively expands its diplomatic and security influence, Ethiopia remains largely passive. Addis Ababa's diplomacy has failed to counter Egypt's maneuvering, instead opting for a reactive approach. There are several critical issues with Ethiopia's current diplomatic stance. Ethiopia has not engaged in meaningful diplomatic efforts to counterbalance Egypt's growing influence. While Kenya and Somalia are signing security pacts with Cairo, Ethiopia has not secured new alliances that reinforce its position. Lack of strategic communication. Egyptian officials, including Foreign Minister Badr Abdel Ati, have been meeting with global powers like the United States to strengthen diplomatic ties. Meanwhile, Ethiopia's engagement with Washington has been minimal. Ethiopia is currently undergoing economic hardships due to its ambitious reform programs, including currency devaluation and IMF-led restructuring. This financial instability weakens Ethiopia's ability to conduct proactive diplomacy. Weakened position post-Tigray War. The Ethiopian government was once able to push back against international pressure during the GERD negotiations, but following the civil war in Tigray, Ethiopia has lost some of its diplomatic capital. The government now seems more focused on internal stability than on countering Egypt's regional moves. What Ethiopia must do. If Ethiopia wants to protect its interests and prevent Egypt from encircling it, it must take immediate diplomatic action. Ethiopia must actively engage Kenya, Djibouti, and Somalia to ensure they do not fall entirely under Egypt's influence. It should push for security and trade agreements that reinforce Ethiopia's regional leadership. Strengthen military and economic ties with Sudan and South Sudan. While Egypt is focused on the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia should counter by deepening its relations with Sudan and South Sudan, securing military and economic agreements that balance Cairo's strategy. Addis Ababa must improve its diplomatic ties with Washington and Brussels. Egypt is already working on strengthening its relations with the US, and Ethiopia cannot afford to remain silent. Ethiopia should reframe GERD as a benefit to the entire region, highlighting its potential to provide affordable electricity to neighboring countries. This would help neutralize Egypt's attempts to frame GERD as a national security threat. Egypt has used platforms like the Arab League to rally diplomatic pressure against Ethiopia. Addis Ababa must counter this by using the AU as a diplomatic tool to push back against Cairo's narratives. Ethiopia is at a critical juncture. If it does not act decisively, it risks being completely surrounded by Egyptian-backed alliances, weakening its regional influence and leaving it vulnerable to diplomatic and security threats. Addis Ababa cannot afford to watch as Egypt encircles it. Ethiopia must wake up from its diplomatic slumber and counter Egypt's aggressive regional strategy before it is too late.